Hey there, this is Dr. Armstrong. We're looking at chapter 9 today, aggression in sport. You know, in about 2003, when I was serving as the athletic director at Northwest Nazarene University in Idaho, we hosted another school for our homecoming for men's basketball. And it was a really hard-fought game, and one of our players and one of their players were really playing each other very closely. And at one point, our player had the ball back to our basket in the paint. He went to pivot toward the basket, holding the ball about chest high, and as he goes around, smacks the other player in the face, just above in the mouth, below the nose, above the teeth, and actually one of the probably worst injuries I've witnessed in person in basketball. He ended up breaking some facial bones. Several teeth were severely damaged. Interestingly though, there was no foul called. The following week I received a call from the athletic director. He wanted to know if we had dismissed the player from the team. They were also requesting that we pay all medical bills. Now, game film was reviewed by the head official, and it was determined that it was unfortunate, but it was an accident due to hard play. The opposing school went so far as to request that the Canyon County in Idaho prosecutor bring criminal charges against our player. Well, that was never going to happen. So, where does this fall in regard to aggression in sport? Particularly intercollegiate men's basketball. Was it intentional? We thought not. Was it aggressive play on the part of our player, knowing his behavior might result in injury to his opponent? We didn't believe there was evidence of this in the game film. Was it simply hard play that fell within the bounds of acceptable college men's basketball? Well, that was our conclusion. It was the conclusion of, like I said, the head official. It was the same conclusion of college counsel. We thought if this was going to result in a lawsuit, maybe we better have legal counsel to head it off. But in the end, nothing became of it, and it goes down in the history books as an unfortunate accident in intercollegiate men's basketball. So, what is aggression? One of the definitions in the text defines it as behavior with intent to inflict pain or harm. That sounds pretty serious. There are different levels or offshoots of that definition. There's proactive assertion. This is where the behavior is forceful, yet it's considered acceptable. There's instrumental aggression. And this is with the intent to achieve a goal, and the opponent may or may not be injured. For example, if this was a hard foul, or a sliding tackle in soccer. There's a goal in mind, and the intent is not to hurt the opponent, but it may happen. And then there's what we call a legitimate act. This is behavior that's acceptable in a given circumstance or context. The defender holds a player, for example, keeping him from scoring an easy layup in transition. And you see that a lot of times in the NBA, where there's a breakaway in transition and somebody grabs the other player knowing there's going to be a foul, and it might even be a flagrant foul, but people accept it based on the context. Your text talks about theoretical bases of aggression. One is territorial imperative, and this is as a means of survival. Now, we don't really apply this within the athletic context. genetics as an explanation. For example, the gene for aggression may be passed along. It's believed that, for example, individuals who are incarcerated are more likely to have children who are incarcerated than those who are not. Then it comes down to a discussion of nature versus nurture. There's the catharsis hypothesis. This is where it's meant to release pent-up anger. In other words, it's one way to get out the aggression that you have. Then there's displacement of aggression, and we see this a lot, and I would dare say that probably every one of us has practiced this. Displacement of aggression, when you're releasing it on a third party or object. You may be mad at somebody else and you take it out on another person. Or you may kick something because you're mad at somebody. It could be that you're watching a news show or a movie or a sporting event. That aggression that you have, you somehow, it's embedded in what you're watching. There's also the frustration-aggression hypothesis. And this is where it's an inability to meet goal. It leads to a frustration and anger, which then leads to aggression. And interestingly, the single most important factor that links frustration and aggression is anger. Now, let's look at this within the context of a Christian worldview. How would you qualify Jesus' anger and his aggressive behavior in the temple when he turned over the merchants' tables and he drove them from the temple court? You recall that. What would you call it? Survival? Would you call it catharsis? Was it displacement of aggression? From what we're told in the Gospels, he exhibited anger. We know that, and we often hear people describe that as righteous anger, giving an excuse for somebody who gets angry. Well, that's righteous anger. I'm not so sure about that. He demonstrated aggression toward the sellers as well as their tables. But was he in control? Does that matter? We know he never sinned, so can we use his behavior to whitewash our own aggressive behavior? We can't really answer these questions with any certainty, but it is interesting to consider this issue. Well, let's talk about aggression and sport performance. Now, you'll note at the beginning of this particular chapter, there's a picture of the inverted U hypothesis model. And this model is really not unlike the one that we talked about earlier in the book having to do with stress. And this particular model, if you'll notice on the y-axis, this represents performance level, and on the x-axis, level of arousal. Now, we looked at this in the last chapter, but what I have put in here, and this is superimposed on the chart in your text as well, this curve, and you'll notice that I have markings on it, x1, x2, and x3, and you notice that the x1 is it's low in performance level. It's also low in arousal, and in terms of aggression, if we look at this curve as an aggression curve, it would be low. Now, as you go down the level of arousal line, you'll notice that the curve goes higher, and at the very peak, what we would consider to be a moderate amount of arousal results in a higher performance level as well as an optimal amount of aggression. Now, if you go farther on in terms of the arousal on the x-axis, you'll notice that the performance level goes down, and in terms of the aggression on the curve, that as well goes down. And it's a bit ironic when you consider it in terms of level of arousal. One of the theories in the last chapter was that the greater the level of arousal, the higher the level of performance, and as a generality. Now, if we put aggression into this formula, then we have to consider, all right, well then what is the optimal amount of arousal if we want to maintain high performance and figure in aggression? Well, for a low level of arousal, this we saw the low aggression and low performance, but is this a generality for us? I mean, can we look at this curve and say, okay, yeah, the higher the level of arousal, the lower the performance level, and along with that, the aggression level is kind of low too. Well, it's an interesting way to look at it, but it can't be used in every case. For example, if we're talking about weightlifters, if you've been in the weight room and you've watched the really serious lifters and the person spotting the other person doing the heavy bench press, they're yelling and they're getting them all psyched up, and so the level of arousal is quite high. And so the idea is to lift your best, so with a higher arousal level, there's a certain amount of aggression involved in that as well. But let's consider how about the person in curling that slides the stone? You see that on TV probably. The stone, I can't describe it really. It's a unique kind of an object, and it slides on the ice, and that person is in kind of a kneeling position and slides with it and then lets it go. Now, where do you think that person is on that curve? If he or she places that stone right where it's supposed to be, we would consider that high performance. Was there a lot of aggression involved? No. How about arousal? Probably not. So here we have a low amount of arousal, very low aggression, yet higher performance. So is there a way to measure aggression? Can we quantify it so we can be more certain than just plotting a position on the curve? Probably not. Not every athlete reacts the same. And this takes us back again to what we said the very first day, and that was that it's up to the coach to be able to identify at what level of arousal, at different varying levels of different kinds of threats to which an athlete responds. Determining aggressive play and categorizing it as a hard foul or with intent to harm is really subjective. There are guidelines for officials to follow, but then it's always up to their intention. You'll notice that, for example, in football, where they do the instant replay or the review, they may initially call this, a hit that is pretty hard, but then they have to go back and determine whether, especially if it's spearing, they don't call it spearing anymore, but leading with the helmet. And there are degrees to that, and if it's the highest degree, then the player is out. But it is to some degree subjective. Let's talk about assertion. Well, while the literature draws a line between aggressive behavior that is acceptable and that which is intended to harm, it is, as we mentioned a few seconds ago, subjective, and by the athlete, the coach, and the official, none of which may agree, and none of which usually agree. One researcher preferred to use the term assertive behavior and let it be judged in terms of appropriate levels of what they call performance intensity. Assertive behavior is intentional and it's learned and it has to be practiced. That's an interesting concept, isn't it? It's not an automatic, always an automatic reaction. Assertive behavior, aggressive behavior would be an automatic reaction. Assertive behavior is more intentional, it's planned, and it's learned. For instance, if we go back to the example of blocking out on a rebound, few players understand that the first time around, and really how intentional you have to be when you get on the court. You run through it in practice and people are just walking through the drill, and the defender doesn't really have to be aggressive or assertive because you're doing it as a drill. And then you find out in the real game, you really do have to be assertive on that. So here's a question. Is assertive behavior acceptable in general? By that I mean, might assertive behavior be considered cheating? Now, again, I'm looking at this, and you may not think this is very realistic, but within the context of a Christian worldview, maybe it's worth discussion. Let me give you another example. Think of a situation, and we're talking about Christian college play here in basketball. You're the basketball coach, and we're in a championship game. You are 3 points ahead with about 5 seconds to go. Your opponent's best 3-point shooter just brought the ball across midcourt. So you're on defense. And he's trying to set up just outside the 3-point arc so that if he makes it, he'll tie the game. Well, you tell your defender to intentionally foul him before he ever shoots. You push him, you grab him, you do something so the official will call a foul. So what will be the worst case scenario? It'll either be a 1-and-1, or if they deem it a harder foul, or maybe you're in the bonus with 10 fouls. Let's say he makes both of them. You're still up by 1, and time may have expired, or just a second or two to go. But if you try and defend the 3-point shot, he might make it and tie, or you might foul, and it might end up being a 4-point play. So is this just a non-issue? Am I making something out of nothing? Or is it just wise coaching? Is it taking advantage of a rule that allows you to, at the very least, be assertive, and at the very worst, be aggressive? And that's a question, again, this may be considered a non-issue by many. You may think, well, that's part of the game, and it is. But as Christians, we need to consider those issues so that we always have an answer. Now, your text talks about some gender differences in sport aggression. Your author notes that, interestingly, female athletes can exhibit aggression the same as male athletes. There are some points, however, to consider. Male athletes usually have more aggressive tendencies than females. When frustrated, male athletes tend more want to injure an opponent, while females try and work harder. Male athletes viewed aggression that might injure as more legitimate than do females. In terms of spectators and violence, researchers believe that the combination of aggressive play and media exposure enhances spectator interest. For example, have you ever been to the stock car races? You go, at least I did as a kid, and you want to see wrecks. Demolition Derby is the favorite because everybody's crashing into everybody's car, and it's no fun if nobody's car gets wrecked. The object is to disable your opponent. People watch the mixed martial arts, and the hope of a lot of spectators is that the one opponent has to what they call tap out. In other words, he's in a chokehold, and if he doesn't say, "I give up," then he may go unconscious. There's the disposition theory of sports spectatorship, and this is that the spectator's reaction to a team reflects his or her alliance with that team. So when they're doing well, enjoyment is high, pleasure is derived. When they're losing, negative feelings are more common. And if you support a college team, even we talk about the Cougars. If the Cougars are winning, you're going to be right there cheering. If they're losing, I'm sure that attendance drops off, and I've seen the same thing at every college that I've worked at. There are some interesting predictors of sport spectator violence that your author lists in no particular order. Alcohol, the presence of alcohol or the sales of alcohol is one. Years ago, and I have this in the PowerPoint, in 1974 or 1977, Cleveland Stadium for a baseball game for the Indians, this is old municipal stadium on the lake, had 10-cent beer night. And just go Google that sometime. 10-cent beer night at Cleveland. It ended in what they call it a brawl game now, not a ball game. The lateness of the game often is a predictor. In Cleveland, for high school football some years ago, they have the Senate League, East and West, I believe, and they made a decision to have all Senate League games play in the daylight because there were lots of fights, just too much violence, and it seemed to help. They found that warm weather tends to be a predictor of sport violence. Cheap seats do. If it doesn't cost anything or it doesn't cost much, for example, if you go to when the Browns again were in the old municipal stadium and the bleacher seats, that's where most of the violence by spectators took place. The seats were cheap and the beer was flowing. And let me just throw in an aside here. Those of you who have been to an Ohio State game lately will know that they now sell alcohol in both in the shot and in the stadium. And the decision, I'm sure, was based primarily on money because they sell lots of beer, but that increases it predicts much higher for violence. And then finally, athletic violence, the violence by the athlete, him or herself, a lot of time tends to lead to violence in the stands. Well, that is it for this particular chapter. I have a couple of reminders for you. Your rough draft is due no later than Friday, April the 3rd at 10 p.m. I've put this online. I just have a few that are left that have not been submitted. Your final draft will be due the 16th on a Thursday at 10 p.m. And hopefully you'll be able to incorporate my comments from your rough draft into your final draft. The last quizzes will be accepted Friday, April 24th at 10 p.m. You can do those at your own pace as long as you have them all done by that date. And then the final exam is the same day as scheduled, Tuesday, April 28th, and that will be online. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll be talking to you again.